Welcome to this semester's first show and tell. My name is Jamie Manser, and I'm the Communications and Events Coordinator for the Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry. So one critical part of our mission is sharing research with the community, and we do that through these show and tell events. Let me show you some of our upcoming events here. So the next event on October 7th is Can't Get You Out of My Head. It's about the Arizona Railroad Project and how songs get stuck. On November 12th, we have Don't Buy, Share. That's a discussion about the evolving sharing community. And on December 2nd, we'll be hosting Playground Games here up on the roof. Playground Games is a super fun event, which is kind of like a cross between speed dating and Shark Tank, but with an academic spin. You can find all the details on our website, confluencecenter.org. Another important part of supporting collaborative research is partnering with other U of A units and community organizations to host scholars that are making an impact. Tonight, U of A Press is our partner in hosting Dr. Ramirez, and right now I'd like to introduce you to the UA Press Director, Catherine Conrad. Catherine was named director in 2012 after working at U of A Press for 15 years. She has 25 years of publishing experience and is leading the UA Press in promoting cross-disciplinary scholarship that specializes in a wide variety of topics, including anthropology, archaeology, Latin American studies, American Indian studies, and the history and culture of the Southwest borderlands, just to name a few. Here to tell you more about the U of A Press is Catherine. Welcome, Catherine.
Get out of the sun here. Hello, we are just thrilled to be here tonight in partnership with the Confluence Center. We're doing two exciting things tonight. We are kicking off the fall season of Show and Tell at Playground. I'm looking forward to all these great events. And we are also celebrating the publication of Cristina Ramirez's first book, Occupying Our Space. Occupying Our Space is a feminist recovery project about the women who really paved the way for today's women journalists in Mexico. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Javier Duran. Javier is a Sonoran Desert native, a 3-time UA alum, and he's been the director of the Confluence Center since 2010. He and his amazing team at the center have been working hard in our community to promote the value of interdisciplinary research and to really communicate the idea that scholarship doesn't belong in silos. It also doesn't belong just on campus, it belongs right here in the community. Javier?
Thank you. Thank you. Gracias. Oops. The sound goes. So it is a pleasure for me to welcome you all to our first show and tell of the year, and to welcome especially our speaker, Cristina Ramirez. She's an assistant professor in the U of A's Rhetoric, Composition, and the Teaching of English graduate program. Christina's work has been published in College English, and of course, we're all here tonight to celebrate the release of her U of A Press published Occupying Our Space book. Recently, Cristina and University of Maryland professor Jessica Enoch received a $10,000 National Council of Teachers of English grant to further the research of recovering primary documents in order to create a bilingual anthology of the rhetorics of more than 20 Mexican and Mexican-American women journalists from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Cristina is an active member in the National Latino Caucus and an active board member of the Academic Coalition of Women Scholars in the History of Rhetoric and Composition. And with that, congratulations on your book, and welcome to Show and Tell. Cristina Ramirez.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out, seeing faces that I know, faces that I don't know, people that I'm meeting for the first time. Thank you, muchas gracias for coming out. Javier, thank you for the introduction. University of Arizona Press, Confluence Center. Jamie, thank you so much for that fabulous interview that you published in Zócalo. I need to pick one up. Javier, how long do I have again? 35 minutes? Do I have 35 minutes? Okay. Okay, because I can talk a lot. I mean, I love this venue, and I love this this idea of show and tell, right? Because I have a lot to tell and a lot to show. So I want to actually start this talking about this incredible mural. This is a painting that I found just by chance on one of my research trips in Durango. This is, I don't know the title of this mural, but it is by a muralist from Durango. His name is Jorge Quiñones Garcia. And this mural is located in Casa de la Cultura in Durango, Mexico. I was just walking down the streets of historical Durango, and I walked into the Casa de Cultura, and bam, here's this image. This image is I wish I could have put this image on the cover of my book. This shows una mujer, pues, mexicana, a Mexican woman, and she has very European features. And as well, she has the Aztec Quetzalcoatl burning in her chest and coursing through her veins, right? This is the epitome of the mestizaje, and this is what I write about in my book. So I'm going to start. I actually, this is why I like this venue, because you can be fun. It's fun. It's light. So there will be two questions, two quiz questions at the end. This could be you. I love cat memes. Pick me. Okay. So and I put Lacri at the end there because at book talks, you get to find out certain things about the author that you would not otherwise know. Lacri is my nickname. So I'm going to go back just a little bit here to the first slide, and I have Ocupando Nuestro Puesto, and I'm going to talk about the title a little bit because some people think that I'm using the title of Occupying Our Space from this whole movement, this whole occupying movement. And that's not true at all. Occupying our space is a translation of a phrase that one of the women that I write about, Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza, she used in 1903 in her newspaper, Vesper Justicia Libertad, right around 7 years before the Mexican Revolution started. And the dictator and the government had, they were beginning to arrest journalists, assassinate them. What is happening right now in the streets of Mexico and also a little bit here in the United States. But she wrote, "Estamos aquí a ocupar nuestro puesto." And when I read that, I'm like, oh, there's my title. I didn't get to, she said, "We are here to occupy our space or also your space." And I thought, there's my title. UA Press, they didn't quite let me use the Ocupando Nuestro Puesto, but maybe next time I'll be able to use a bilingual title. So I want to talk first about how I came to research Mexican women journalists, how and why. Because this is the question that I always get asked in presentations, even very academic ones. So it goes back to the summer before I started the PhD program at University of Texas at El Paso. And so I'm going to give you kind of a, not too long of a version, but the version. And I started writing a book on Chicana identities. And one of the protagonists in that book was to have been an abuela, a grandmother. And she was to have been, so this is the book that has not been written. So I'm telling you a little bit about that one too. And she was to have been an Adelita. How many of you know who the Adelitas were? The Adelitas were the Mexican women who went out into the battlefield. They were nurses, they were soldiers, they were cooks, they were lovers, they were wives out there supporting their men. And I realized that I didn't really know anything about these women, and so I went to the books to learn about who they were. And I found a book by Shirlene Soto, The Emergence of the Modern Mexican Woman, Her Role in the Revolution. And at the end of each chapter, she dedicated maybe 2 pages to the women writers and journalists at that time. And at that moment, I remember when I swallowed that book in one night. And I read about these women: Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza, Laurena Wright de Kleinhans, Ermila Galindo, Dolores Jiménez y Muro. And I was like, oh, these are the women that I'm supposed to write about. And now this is what I like about being in this venue, is that I can talk about this. I felt like these women tapped me on the shoulder because I was like interpolated. I couldn't let go of these women. So that's how I found these women. And throughout this process of researching, the serendipitous moments, not only in my life, but also researching in the archives. So one of the first places I went to do research was in Durango, Mexico. And so one of the questions that I might get, and you're probably asking, well, why did you go to Durango, Mexico? The archives in Durango, Mexico at this time in 2005, 2006 were still not digitized. And how is it that I knew about these archives? Short story, one of the undergraduate students, she was from Durango and she invited me. One December, I find myself on a bus at 6 o'clock at night in Juarez, blasting down to Durango. And this was actually at the time when it was starting to get dangerous. But sin miedo, no fear. I was going down with this Gonzalez family, and they took me to Durango. And I ended up going to the Biblioteca Pública Central Estatal José Ignacio Gallegos Caballero. Whew. Very Mexican, right? And I'm not going to pretend that I had a research question. I didn't. I just went to see. I went with a curiosity, with a wanting to know. And this picture up here of, this is what I was going through. These are the kinds of, I was pulling out these big books and looking through there, and I found a feminist manifesto, and it's my chapter 3 on these women called Las Mujeres de Zitácuaro. And it just, I stumbled upon this manifesto. I was at a conference in Oaxaca, and this woman was presenting, and she mentioned Las Mujeres de Zitácuaro, and I had never heard anyone say Las Mujeres de Zitácuaro. I went up to her afterwards, and I said, "Do you have this document?" And she answered to me, and she said, "No, I don't have this document. I've been looking for it for the better part of 25 years. And I said, "I have it." So the serendipity of my research has been ongoing. So here's some other images of the archives. And so this is a really interesting story. These are some backstories, and then I'll get to the book. But I ended up in San Juan del Rio Durango. How many of you know who Pancho Villa is? Raise your hand. We all know, right? We all know who Pancho Villa is. And if you're a Mexican-American family, you probably have a story in your background that has to do with your grandfather running into Pancho Villa or somebody, My grandma made tamales for Pancho Villa one time, Everyone has that story. Pancho Villa, Doroteo Arambula, is actually from San Juan del Rio Durango. The woman that I write about in my chapter 2 is from San Juan del Rio Durango. But she was a revolutionary with her pen, not the sword. And so I end up, and I'm not going to so much, do I have? Yeah, I have a little bit of time. I'll tell you the story on how I got to San Juan de Rio, Durango. I was in the archives in Durango, and the director, he called me to his office, and I'm thinking, oh man, I'm in trouble. Well, he sits me down and he asks me, he's like, pues all of this is in Spanish, and he's like, what are you doing here? And so very few American researchers even know about these non-digitized archives in Durango. He said, what are you doing here? And I go into like this 15, 20-minute spiel on how I know the history of Durango, of this woman, Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza, that I just found this amazing document in your archives from Las Mujeres de Zitácuaro, and he just sat there with his face like, this is my library, this is my archive, and I don't know any of this. He picks up the phone and he calls the mayor of San Juan de Rio, Durango, because that's where Juana Belén was born. And he gets on the phone and he says, well, I'm from San Juan de Rio, Durango. And he gets on the phone and he talks to the mayor and he hangs up the phone and he says, they're expecting you there tomorrow. And I thought, how? And I turned to Chelly, she was my research assistant because I wasn't thinking straight. And I'm like, Chelly, how are we going to get to San Juan de Rio, Durango? It's like 2.5 hours out. Her mom had a car that was being held together with tape and wire, and we knew that it was not going to make it. And her mom was the one who dictated, and she said, no van a ir en autobús. You're not going to go in bus because it drops you off 10 miles from San Juan de Rio, Durango. Well, I had given up on getting to San Juan de Rio, Durango the next day. We show up to the house, and we're like, Chelly, we're not going to go. It's 10 o'clock at night. Her mom's cousin, like third cousin removed, something like that, is there at the house. It's 10 o'clock, and they would ask her mom, pues, ¿qué está haciendo aquí? What is she doing here? And she said, well, ask her. She can explain to you. And I told him my 10-minute spiel that I'm a graduate student, I'm here researching. And then like at 10:45, he said, be ready at 8:30 in the morning. I'm picking you up and we're going. And so the next morning, I find myself going to San Juan de Rio, Durango. And that's where I find Juana Belén Gutiérrez's fe de bautismo, her baptismal record. Of course, they have Pancho Villa's, right? They have Pancho Villa's birth certificate, right? And I met these ladies. These ladies heard that I was here, a scholar, una americana. She's here to do some research. And they come out, the librarians, and they had called their open-air library that they had there in San Juan de Rio, Durango, the Juana Belén Gutiérrez Biblioteca. And I'm like, that is just too cool. So these are images of the streets of San Juan de Rio, Durango. So what has contributed to the lack of research? So now I'm going to shift gears. I was giving you some fun stories, and I'm going to get a little bit more academic here. What has contributed to the lack of research and representation of Mexican women and Mexican women writers? So, I mean, besides the machismo in the cultura mexicana, right? I mean, women were just silenced. Their place and space in society was in the home, in the kitchen, washing the dishes, washing the laundry. But this is what historian Carlos Monsiváis, he's a very prominent Mexican historian, and he says this. He says, skeptics until recently, the majority of Mexican historians, and I'm talking maybe about 20, 25 years, derided the act of exploring Mexican women's history as one of feminine romantic willfulness. The search for a small group of insignificant actors in obscure places. Yeah, tell these women, yeah, okay, that they were insignificant. I would not mess with them. This image comes from the University of Texas at El Paso. They have this in their image bank. So in the last 20 years, even in Mexico and here in the States, there has been a huge surge of research about Mexican women writers, soldaderas, women who have acted in society. So we all know of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right? I believe she's on the 200 bill in Mexico. She's on the 200 peso bill. Mexico has beat us to putting a woman on a bill. That, I don't know, that says something. But so in my discipline of rhetoric, and I'm going to explain what rhetoric is here in just a moment, but in my discipline, we have really one mujer mexicana, one Mexican woman in the canon, and that is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. We also have, or we have claimed Gloria Anzaldúa, but she's not even Mexican. She's Chicana. She's Chicana. So there is one Mexican woman, speaker, writer, rhetor in the rhetorical canon, and that is it. And so I have here Elena Poniatowska. She's actually one of the more prominent Mexican women journalists. She's still alive. She became very famous in the 1960s for covering the student riots from '68. And I put this picture here of this guy standing in front of the Grand Canyon like this, because it is not just a gap in research, but a chasm. It's like huge. And so it's going to take like my entire life to try and fill this. So that's why we should be recovering these women voices, and it's extremely important that we do. So what is rhetoric? Rhetoric has a bad rap. The journalists use rhetoric and say, oh, the politicians are using the rhetoric, blah, blah, blah. So here is a definition of rhetoric, why I use the lens, a rhetorical lens, instead of maybe a literary lens, because what these women were doing was not literary. They were not writing novelas. They were not writing poemas, although some were. They were not writing cuentos. These women were writing pieces in journalism. They were trying to shift and change the reality of what was going on in their society. And so rhetoric, a rhetorical lens, provides us the perfect lens with which to examine what these women were saying. So here's a definition that I like to use from Covino and Joliffe, and they use, and this is the one that I use in my book, that rhetoric is a primarily verbal, situationally contingent, wrap your brain around these words, epistemic art that is both philosophical and practical and gives rise to potentially active texts. Well, what the heck is epistemic? Does anyone know what? No one from RCTE can answer this question. Anybody else who knows what epistemic is? And the root word is episteme. Anyone? Maybe? No? Okay. That's all right. I won't put you on the spot. Epistemic or episteme means the study of knowledge or knowledge, right? And so if something is an epistemic art, if discourse is an epistemic art, what are you doing when you're doing art? You're creating, right? You're creating. So from a rhetorical lens, looking at these women's writings from a rhetorical lens, my underlying argument is that these women were creating knowledge. And that puts them in the realm of intellectuals, right? Which these women, they were not considered as intellectuals. And so what I'm doing here is I'm really shifting that discourse in a radical kind of way by using a rhetorical lens. I also have in my book a definition that the Mexican scholars use of rhetoric. Beristain and Ramirez Vidal, they say that rhetoric is contained inevitably in every verbalization of the human being, and scholars of rhetoric have as one of their tasks to analyze this natural aspect of language. So now I'm going to explain another major term in my book, which is mestiza rhetoric. And I give an entire chapter to this. So I'm going to try and explain this in 2 minutes. The mestizaje is this coming together of the European and the indigenous culture, right? Going back to 1519, when Hernán Cortés came and conquered Mexico, right? And so the definition of mestiza rhetoric refers to the method of the discourse that these women were using at this time, because they identified themselves as mestizas. They talked about la raza, the mestizaje, somos mestizas. And if you look at the mestiza or the mestizo discourse at that time, it was men that were writing. José Vasconcelos, La Raza Cósmica, that's all that people know, or José Martí, but he's Cuban, right? These were the male intellectuals who were talking about mestizaje at this time. There was no women that were doing that. So what I'm claiming with mestiza rhetoric is that these women were framing themselves within this culture that claimed a dual identity, that imagined they were, this feminine rhetorical method positions the women writers as feminine initiators of cultural knowledge. This is a radical, again, aspect of my framing of these women. So when I first started my project, I was going to base my concept of mestiza rhetoric in Gloria Anzaldúa. And any of you who know Gloria Anzaldúa, she's Chicana. When I presented my research down in Mexico, they said, no, you can't do that, because she's Chicana and these women are Mexican. I threw out 2 chapters after I went to that conference, and I said, I am going to have to rewrite this, or they are not going to, they're going to think that my scholarship is a farce. So I ground my concept of mestizaje in Malintzin. I don't call her La Malinche. Remember, she is the interpreter. She was the quote-unquote mistress of Hernán Cortés. Mexico, a lot of Mexico sees her as a traitor, but there's a little story that people forget, is that she was sold into slavery by her family to the Spaniards. She was all about survival. When you're sold into slavery to the enemy, you're all about surviving, right? So I claim that the moment that when she opened her mouth, because she became that conduit, that bridge between these 2 major empires of Europe and the Aztec Empire. She was the bridge. She was the interpreter. And so what she said between these 2 empires is what ruled, right? And so I say the moment that she opened her mouth and spoke and said that she knows Nahuatl and Spanish is the moment that the mestiza rhetoric was born. A lot of people say that mestizaje was born through the biological, right? When she gave birth to Hernan Cortes's son. But I remove that sexual aspect of her. And I give her the intellectual when she first spoke. And she stood between these two cultures. Her life and the life of these two empires was immediately altered. So now I'm going to shift gears because I have about 10 minutes, and I'm going to just talk about two of the Mexican women journalists. And I'm going to actually read for you some of their writings. So the first woman I'm going to talk about is Laurena Wright de Kleinhans. Very interesting. You know, look at her name. Her last name is Wright de Kleinhans. She was born in 1842 in Mexico City to an American father and a Mexican mother, hence Wright. But she received one of, an elite education. I don't know if she went to Europe. I could not find that about her. But she married a German. And there's lots of Germans in Mexico. Se casó con un alemán. But what is absolutely amazing about Laurena Wright de Kleinhans is that she gained such a control of this high, almost Baroque Spanish at the time, that she was challenging the male intellectuals at that time. She was allowed into the intellectual poetic lyceums. Mexican women were not allowed at all in these spaces, and she was welcomed in. So she was actually the literary editor of this journal called Las Hijas de la Náhuac. Anáhuac is the Aztec kingdom, which is now Mexico City. So here comes the mestizaje part, right? These women were claiming this indigenous heritage. They were saying that we are daughters of la antigüedad, the indigenous antiquity, right? But they're stuck in a conundrum, and it's the conundrum that will forever be the mestizaje, right? It will never be resolved. So these women were claiming this indigenous space, but at the same time, they were writing in this exclusionary Spanish. So I say in my book that they wrote themselves into a rhetorical conundrum. And the other rhetorical conundrum that they were writing about, because they were claiming that women should have an education, that women should be out writing stories, poetry, blah, 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 but they also really kind of kept women within the framing of the home. So women were just beginning to push out of their space, of their puesto of the home. So I'd like to read for you. In my book, I have, my book is very bilingual in that I translate all of the titles. All of the titles are translated for you. I've read so many books that they leave the French titles, the Spanish titles, the German titles, and I'm like, I don't know what this means. At one time, maybe scholars could read German and French and all that, but I come at it from a very feminist perspective, and I translate all the titles for you. And I also include primary documents in Espanol and also in English. And all throughout my text, when I use these women's writings as examples, I put the Spanish first. I value their voices and I place them first, and then I put the English translation. So, yes, thank you. So and that was a very rhetorical move on my part of what I did in this book. And so I'm going to read to you just an excerpt of one of Laurena Reite Kleinhans's from the very beginning of Las Hijas de la Náhuac. And I have it up here in English, and I'm going to read it to you in Spanish so you can follow along. Saludos. Con el ramo de oliva entre las manos como muestra de regeneración intelectual de la mujer, vivificadas con las puras enseñanzas de la antigüedad, se presenta hoy al público el modesto periódico Las Hijas de la Náhuac. Irreverentemente dirige su cordial saludo a todas las clases de la sociedad, a la prensa de todos los matices políticos y a los hombres del poder y del Estado, trilogía poderosa que con sus magníficos arneses ha podido evolucionar victoriosamente en beneficio de la paz, el orden y la cultura de la patria mexicana. I don't know about you, but I think it kind of sounds beautiful in Spanish, right? And you can almost hear the elevated language, right, that she was using here. So that's Laurena. Laurena was, she was writing from a very controlled time. She was writing during the Porfiriato, but this is the woman that I really like to talk about. Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza. She was the revolutionary. She was the foot in the door. She was the one saying, we are here and we're going to stay here. Juana Belén, she was, and so I like these, to show the difference, because Laurena was from the elite, Juana was grassroots. I mean, she was pobre. She received nothing more than a third grade education. She claimed indigenous heritage from her mother. She taught herself how to read and write. She was really something else. She picked up herself and her 3 children as a widow and went to Guanajuato in 1900 to start her own newspaper. I mean, and she went with her goat Sancha too, because she sold Sancha eventually to buy ink and papel, ink and paper. Juana, I mean, look at that picture. She's standing there with her hand, a very Napoleonic stance, right? I love that picture of her. So these images are, I went to Guanajuato this summer and last year. This image here on the right, on the left, is the streets of Guanajuato today. And I think it looks very much like what Guanajuato would have looked like in 1900. And this is a Golding Pearl letterpress. That's at the entrance of the Biblioteca in Durango, Mexico. And I took a picture of that and I looked that up, and that might have been something that she would have been using. The journalists that time would actually roll these presses around. They would pull them by oxen and go from pueblo to pueblo and print up manifestos or planes and then pass them out or nail them to the walls, to the walls and to the trees, to talk about their proposed policies for change. So now I'm going to read a little bit of what Juana wrote. This was actually from 1903. About 2.5 months after she published this, she was thrown into jail. She was thrown into jail probably about 8 or 9 times. I don't know. After the first or second time that I was thrown into jail, I don't know. I don't know if I would even have had the guts to continue writing, right? So this is what she wrote that got her in big trouble. She says, la dictadura no se detiene ya ni ante el ridículo. Ha hecho denunciar a Vesper y ha dedicado órdenes de aprehensión para la señorita Elisa Cunha y Rosete y para la dictadura, la directora de este periódico. Si esto no es cobarde, que venga Dios y lo diga. Pobre México, pobre patria mía. Serás la primera nación donde se encarcelan mujeres por el delito de escribir en defensa del pueblo. En cambio, también será Porfirio Díaz el primer hombre que tiene miedo a las mujeres. I think that's what got her thrown into jail right there, right? Y en su espanto se olvida hasta de ocultarlo, como hasta aquí había ocultado su cobardía tras de inicuos alardes de fuerza. Yeah, that probably would earn her a couple months in jail, I think. So why do these voices matter? On NPR, Fernanda Echavarri asked me a question that I knew that would be coming. How do you connect these women, these historical women, to the women who are writing now in Mexico? I've got 2 minutes. This is wrapping up. These women in Mexico, the historical women, they were one of they were the, and I call them the groundbreakers. But I also call them their abuelas and their tías, their grandmothers and their aunts, their discursive grandmothers who paved the way for these women. I don't know if you've heard of these women. Anabel Hernandez, do you know who she is? She's kind of a badass. Oops, I'm giving, there's the... Anabel Hernandez, she wrote Narco Nation. They've tried to assassinate her quite a few times. She's been arrested. También Lydia Cacho, she's another badass. Adela Micha, she's another journalist, badass. These women are speaking truth to power in Mexico today. When Mexico fluctuates, Mexico is sometimes third, sometimes fourth, sometimes the most dangerous country in this world to be a journalist. And these women are speaking out and trying to make a change in their country. Lydia Cacho, she was kidnapped. They tried to assassinate her. I don't know about Adela Micha, but definitely Anabel Hernandez. These are incredibly courageous women. So with that, DR, she knows. I know. Quiz question number 1. Okay, where were the non-digitized archives located that I visited early in my research for this book? Okay, so let's... Raul. Where? In Durango, Mexico. Actually, some journalists were killed there as well. Question number 1. Quiz question number 2. This one, it's tricky if you were paying attention. So, what was the name of the women's journal which Laurena Wright de Kleinhans served as literary editor? Las Hijas de la Náhuac, okay? I have up there Las Mujeres de México, Las Hijas de la Náhuac. It was Las Hijas del Náhuac. So I believe I have run out of time. I probably went 5 minutes over. I think, are we going to open it up for questions now? Javier? Okay. So, any questions? Okay.
Raul, so you scrapped a couple of chapters about Gloria. So are you going to write another book about that? Because, as a Chicana writer, and I mean, when you mentioned that statement, it was like, so something has to be written about her.
Well, I actually don't. So Raul asked if I'm going to write another book. Actually, I have another manuscript that I'm about to submit. I'm a beast. I just kept writing. But I have so much research on these women. You know, I got the $10,000 grant from National Council of Teachers of English to continue my research. And I'm submitting another book, but this is a bilingual anthology of Mexican women journalists and Mexican American women journalists. So women like Elena Arizmendi, who was from Mexico, but they were writing here in the States. Chicana journalists like Jovita Idar will be coming out in this book. So there's so much. Gloria, and she actually doesn't fall within the time period that I'm writing about, but Gloria Anzaldúa she was writing in the 80s. But I don't know if I'll be writing a book on Gloria Anzaldúa. Oh, no, actually those 2 chapters, what I was doing there is I was basing my theory of mestiza rhetoric through Gloria Anzaldúa, and so I just scrapped it. Any other questions? Okay.
Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Abby. I can tell you really are passionate about these women, and so I apologize for putting you on the spot, but which one would you say is your favorite?
My favorite, I would have to say, is Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza. I actually had a great aunt, my tia Juana. So I feel almost a connection with Juana. I mean, because she was just so fearless. And sometimes I don't know if I could do that, you know? I mean, you know, be thrown in jail and be persecuted and all of this. So I would have to say she's my favorite. I love those kinds of questions.
I really enjoy the history of it. I've been living in Mexico for the past few years, and I'm a journalist from there. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's happening now. I missed the first part, but I don't know if you talked a little bit about what's happening right now and the importance of what's happened in Mexico City recently.
And what is your name? Yasmin Khan.
Yasmin Khan. K-H-A-N. And Yasmin is from the Americas program in Mexico City, and she is also a periodista, a journalist. And she asked me to speak about what's happening right now. And Yasmin, I didn't talk about this book is a very historical book about the women from the 1880s through the turn of the century. But I've been, because I knew that I would get asked this about the significance of what's happening right now. So there's a group called the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ. And it's an international committee that they focus on the protection of journalists, not just in Mexico, but throughout the world. Right now in Mexico, it's extremely dangerous to be a journalist. Not just a journalist, but a photojournalist. They're killing bloggers. They're killing photographers, and not just, under cover of night. They're killing these people, these journalists who are speaking truth to power. They're killing them in broad daylight. In broad daylight. Kind of what just happened up was it in Virginia? I believe here, just recently. But it's pretty awful what's happening, and that's why I mentioned, Yasmin, at the end of my talk about these women. I know that like Anabel Hernandez wrote Narco Nation, and she is now, well, she's in partial hiding from what I understand. Lydia Cacho also outed the government and their connection to pedophilia. Adela Micha, she is a radio journalist. She comes on daily in Mexico. Another very important female journalist in Mexico, and she's actually number 2 on the Mexico Forbes list of the most important people in Mexico, is Carmen Aristegui. Carmen Aristegui is the director of CNN Mexico, I believe. And these women are really making waves. Another woman that I want to mention is Maria Hinojosa. Maria Hinojosa was actually born in Mexico City and was raised in Chicago. But she's doing some really significant things here with Latino USA, the Futuro group that she's got going on in New York. So she's bringing a lot of, she's Mexicana. She was born in Mexico City. I don't know how she identifies as either Mexicana or Chicana or Latina. I'm not going to say, but she's doing a lot of very important work here in the States, bringing the importance of the Latino voice, the Chicano voice, however you want to say it, to the fore, to the radio waves. I do know that, like Anabel Hernandez, all of these women have won significant awards, publishing awards, throughout their careers. But that's a really important question, and there is a bridge between the women who had been writing then and those who are writing now. Thank you. Yeah.
Good, how are you? I was wondering what kind of international connections the Mexican women had. Were they close to women in Colombia, Venezuela, or were there other ferment happening?
What's your first name?
Liz.
Liz. So I just got asked a question by Liz Kennedy. She started gender women's studies here in the United States. So she's a significant person here to be asking this question. She asked me, what kind of international connections did these women have, if they had connections with women writers maybe in Colombia or Peru or Europe. Well, what I do know, I don't know if they necessarily had connections. Well, first of all, there was a Spanish woman living in Mexico, Flaquer de Concepción de Flaquer. She was an international woman she was a journalist and a writer, and she was living in Mexico from Spain, I believe. I don't know about the international connections, but what I can say is that these women were reading international works. There's one, Liz, one of the segments that they had, that Laurena Wright de Kleinhans had in her women's literary journal, Mujeres de Nuestra Época. It was a section called Mujeres de Nuestra Época. And they would write about women from all over the world. And remember, this is 1887. There's no internet. There's no TV. There's only newspaper, right? So for these women to know about women from Belgium, from Europe, from the United States, from Spain, from France, from South America, from England, they had to have their ears to, the international newspapers. So we know that there was a lot of French influence in Mexico, very international. And so these elite women, they probably knew several languages, Spanish and French, maybe some German as well, some English. And so that's how they were getting their news. So that's what I can say on international connections. Do we have time for one more question? One more question.
Thank you. I was just curious about, I know that you talked about mestizaje and how women spoke about indigenous, right, like indigenous issues that were their issues, but did you come across any women journalists or any of the writings that maybe some of these women or other women of the time would have done in their traditional language that wouldn't have been in Spanish? It would have been in Nahua or some other dialect.
Your name is Rose? Marisol. Marisol. Marisol asked me if I came across any writings that these women did in an indigenous language. The answer is no. However, what I did come across, and I'm going to go back to Juana Belén, and this is why I think, oops, I don't know what I did. But anyways, so Juana Belén wrote a treaty. She wrote a treaty called Por la Tierra y por la Raza. And this treaty was like a 4-chapter booklet like this. And she was responding to José Vasconcelos. José Vasconcelos, the raza cósmica, as we know now, is very racist, right? He writes about the solving the indigenous problem, right? That we will have this 6th perfect race, and that it will supplant the indigenous identity, right? Well, Juana understood what he was writing at this time, and she wrote a treaty, this treaty saying that we will not be silenced. And she wrote and published this in 1924. And I actually have the original piece, and it needs to be translated into English. And there's parts in there where she's screaming at her audience in all capital letters, we will not be silenced, we will not disappear off the face of this earth. So she didn't necessarily write in Nahua, but she wrote about the origin stories of her people. So yeah, I didn't find any Nahua writings, and I'm sure that there were people who were writing.
Okay, and her voice is gone. All right, so let's all give it up for Lacri. Awesome.